One of the strangest clues in the New Testament is hiding in a letter most people read in a few minutes and then move past. It appears in the letter of Jude, and it raises a question that refuses to stay quiet. Jude says, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men. Then he gives the prophecy. The problem is simple. If you open Genesis, you will find Enoch's name. You will find his place in the family line before the flood. You will even find the mysterious line that he walked with God and then was taken. But you will not find that prophecy there. So where did Jude get it? That is where the case begins, because Jude is not speaking as if he is guessing. He writes as if he expects his readers to recognize the source. He does not pause to defend the quotation. He does not explain who Enoch is. He writes as if the name already carries weight. In other words, this was not a private thought or a random phrase. It was a known tradition. A text was already circulating. People knew it. And at some point, many Christians stopped seeing it in their Bibles. That is the first clue. Not that Enoch was invented late, not that someone in the Middle Ages created a fantasy and pushed it backward into sacred history. The first clue is smaller but stronger. The New Testament itself contains a fingerprint. Before we argue about councils, lost books, or hidden truths, we have to begin there. Jude is telling us that Enoch belonged to a world his readers could recognize. Now, we need to move carefully because this is where people usually run too fast in one direction or the other. One side says if Jude quoted Enoch, then the entire book must belong in the Bible, and the church hid it. The other side says if the book is not in my Bible, then it must be worthless, fraudulent, or irrelevant. Both moves are too quick. A quotation proves influence. It proves knowledge. It proves the tradition mattered enough to be recognized. But it does not settle every later question about canon, authority, liturgical use, or universal reception.
And that matters, because the easiest version of this story is also the weakest one. The easy version says powerful leaders found a dangerous book and erased it because it revealed too much. It is dramatic, it is simple, it feels satisfying, but the evidence points to a more demanding mystery. A book can be ancient without becoming canonical everywhere. A book can be respected without becoming binding scripture for every church. And a book can leave traces so deep that, even after it falls outside most canons, it still refuses to disappear. That is exactly why the Book of Enoch matters. Not because we need sensational claims, not because every line in it carries the same weight as Genesis or the Gospels. It matters because it opens a window into the world around the New Testament. It shows us that the first Christians did not live inside a thin, flat universe. Their world was crowded with judgment, rebellion, angels, corrupted power, and the expectation that history was moving toward a final reckoning. Once you see that, Jude stops sounding strange. He starts sounding native to his own world. So the real question is no longer, did Enoch exist as a text? Jude already tells us we're dealing with something real enough to cite. The better question is this: what kind of book was it? Why did people know it, and why did most of the Christian world eventually place it outside the canon while one ancient church kept preserving it? Here is the short verdict for the first stage of the investigation. The Book of Enoch was not a modern invention, and it was not a meaningless curiosity. It belonged to the mental and spiritual landscape behind parts of the New Testament. But influence is not the same thing as canon, and that difference is where the mystery starts to sharpen. In the next chapter, we follow Enoch back before the flood, back into the brief lines of Genesis, and ask why one almost silent figure became the center of one of the boldest and most controversial traditions in ancient religious literature.
If Jude gives us the first fingerprint, Genesis gives us the silence around it. He walks with God, and he was not because God took him. The chapter does not satisfy curiosity. It creates it. It leaves behind exactly the kind of gap that later generations were bound to feel. And once that gap existed, The questions began pressing in. Why is Enoch singled out? What does it mean to walk with God in a way that sets one man apart from an entire chain of mortal endings? Why does his story close not with death, but with removal? This is where the investigation becomes more interesting than the myth, because the Book of Enoch did not rise out of nowhere like a random fantasy attached to an ancient name. It emerged from a real tension inside the biblical text itself. Genesis gives us a figure who is briefly introduced, mysteriously elevated, and then taken out of sight before the reader can understand him. In ancient religious imagination, that kind of figure does not stay small. A man like that becomes a question waiting for expansion.
And that expansion tells us something important about the world that produced it. Ancient readers did not approach brief and unusual passages the way modern readers often do. They did not always leave the silence untouched. Sometimes they entered it. Sometimes they treated the gap as a doorway. If a man walked with God and was taken, then perhaps he was shown things other men never saw. If he stood so close to the divine presence, then perhaps he became a witness to hidden judgments, angelic rebellion, cosmic order, and the future of the world. The logic is not arbitrary. It grows out of the shape of the biblical clue itself. That does not mean every later detail attached to Enoch automatically carries biblical authority. It means the seed was already there. The mystery was already active. The later tradition did not invent the name first and then search for a Bible verse to justify it. It started with a verse strange enough to invite a much larger tradition around it. That distinction matters, because once we see it, the Book of Enoch stops looking like an alien text forced into biblical history. It starts looking like a response to a pressure point inside biblical history. There is another reason this matters. Enoch is not merely a curious figure with an unusual ending. In the structure of Genesis, he stands before the flood, before the collapse of the old world, before judgment breaks across human corruption. That location is not a small detail. It places him near one of the darkest turning points in Scripture. So when later tradition turns Enoch into a witness, a recorder, and a messenger of judgment, it is not inventing drama from nothing. It is drawing energy from where he stands in the story, close to the world before its ruin, close to the questions of corruption, violence, and divine response.
Now the shape of the case is becoming clearer. Jude pointed us to a known tradition. The biblical text itself made that impossible. It does not speak gently. It opens with rebellion in the unseen realm, corruption on earth, and a vision of judgment that helps explain why this book gripped so many readers long before the canon question was ever settled. That is why Enoch's silence matters as much as his name. Sometimes what Scripture says briefly becomes powerful, not because it says too little to matter, but because it says enough to begin a chain of questions that history refuses to drop. And that is exactly what happened here. In the next chapter, we move from the man to the message, because once the Book of Enoch begins to speak in full, it does not speak gently. It opens with rebellion in the unseen realm, corruption on earth, and a vision of judgment that helps explain why this book gripped so many readers long before the canon question was ever settled.
Once the Book of Enoch begins to speak, it does not sound like a quiet meditation on a forgotten patriarch. It sounds like an attempt to explain how a world collapses. And that is the point where many readers first understand why this book mattered so much. It does not merely add color to the edges of Genesis. It takes one of the darkest and shortest passages in the Bible and treats it as the fracture line of an entire age. In Genesis, the scene is brief and unsettling. The sons of God see the daughters of men. They take. The earth moves toward violence. The flood approaches. The text gives us just enough to feel the weight of something wrong, but not enough to map the mechanism in full. The Book of Enoch steps directly into that gap. It says the corruption of the world was not only human in scale, it was amplified by rebellion from above. In its telling, heavenly beings crossed a boundary, entered the human story in forbidden ways, and helped drag the world toward ruin. This is where the case becomes difficult for modern readers, because Enoch does not think like a modern reader. It does not separate the visible and invisible realms as neatly as we often do. It presents history as layered. Human violence is real, but it is not always isolated. Corruption on earth is tied to corruption in the unseen realm. Rebellion does not stay in heaven. It spills downward.
Knowledge is not always a blessing. Power is not always neutral. And judgment is not presented as divine overreaction, but as a response to contamination that has spread through an entire order of life. That is why the Watchers matter so much in this book. They are not treated as decorative myth or background symbolism. They are central to its explanation of why the ancient world became so distorted. They cross a line. They transmit forbidden knowledge. They help produce chaos instead of order. And in doing so, they become a pattern. The message is larger than one strange episode. The message is that corruption becomes far more dangerous when power abandons its proper limits. Now we can see why this book would grip readers living in a world full of empire, oppression, spiritual fear, and apocalyptic expectation. Enoch offers a moral map of disorder. It says the world is not broken only because people make mistakes. It is broken because rebellion can become systemic, layered, and reinforced from levels human beings do not fully control. That vision is severe, but it is not random. It gives moral weight to history. It tells its readers that violence, arrogance, and corruption are not loose accidents drifting through time. They belong to a larger crisis that God sees clearly and will judge openly. That, in turn, helps explain why some lines in the New Testament sound less strange when heard against an Enochic backdrop. Judgment is not distant. Falling powers are not imaginary. The age is moving toward exposure. Hidden corruption will not remain hidden forever. Even when the New Testament does not quote Enoch directly, it often moves inside a world where themes like rebellious powers, restrained evil, cosmic accountability, and final reckoning already feel familiar. The Book of Enoch did not create all of those themes by itself, but it became one of the clearest vessels carrying them. Still, this is the moment where the investigation must stay disciplined. Influence is not the same as endorsement of every detail. A powerful explanation is not automatically inspired scripture, and a dramatic account of unseen rebellion is not self-authenticating just because it feels vivid. The importance of Enoch lies partly in how much it reveals about the imagination of the age around early Judaism and early Christianity. It shows us what kinds of questions people were asking, what kinds of dangers they were naming, and why brief biblical clues could grow into full narrative worlds. So the real force of this chapter is not just that Enoch tells a darker story than Genesis tells directly. It is that Enoch tries to explain the logic of collapse. Why does a world become violent? Why does corruption spread so quickly? Why does judgment become unavoidable? Its answer is unsettling. Evil deepens when boundaries are abandoned, when power teaches destruction, and when rebellion becomes cultural before it becomes visible. That is why the Book of Enoch survived in memory, even where it did not survive in canon. It offered something readers could feel immediately. It made the world intelligible at its darkest edge. It gave a shape to catastrophe. And for many readers, that made it unforgettable. In the next chapter, the investigation turns to the question that keeps this case alive. If this book was ancient, influential, and serious enough to leave marks around the New Testament world, why did most of the Christian tradition stop short of giving it full canonical standing? Now the case reaches its hardest question. If the Book of Enoch was ancient, serious, and influential enough to leave visible traces around the New Testament world, why did most of the Christian tradition stop short of giving it full canonical standing? That question matters because this is the point where many people become impatient. They want one clean answer. Either the church recognized the truth and preserved it, or the church feared the truth and pushed it aside. But most real historical cases do not break that neatly, and this one does not either. The first thing we need to understand is that ancient influence and canonical status were never identical. A text could be respected, copied, quoted, and discussed without receiving the same standing as the law, the prophets, or the apostolic writings. That distinction may frustrate modern readers, but it is essential to the investigation. Canon was not simply a list of interesting or even powerful books. It was a boundary of texts received as normative for the life, worship, and doctrine of the community. And boundaries like that were not drawn by curiosity alone. That helps explain why the Book of Enoch remained important without becoming universal. It carried themes many early readers recognized. It spoke in a world of judgment, angels, rebellion, corruption, and final reckoning. In some circles, that made it deeply compelling, but compelling is not the same thing as binding. A book can illuminate the atmosphere around Scripture without being placed on the same level as Scripture itself. That is one of the central distinctions this case keeps forcing us to make. There is another factor. The church did not inherit a world where every valued text arrived with one uncontested status. Early Jewish and Christian communities lived among layers of writings. Some read publicly, some used for instruction, some valued for moral seriousness, some treated with caution, and some disputed from region to region. The question was not merely whether a book contained powerful material. The question was whether it was received broadly enough, clearly enough, and consistently enough to function as a common rule for the whole body. And here the Book of Enoch faced a real difficulty. It was known, but not everywhere in the same way. It was influential, but not universally received. It was preserved strongly in some streams, yet it did not secure the same broad, durable recognition across the wider Christian world that the core canonical books eventually received. That matters more than modern conspiracy language usually admits. The issue was not simply whether someone wanted the book gone. The deeper issue was whether the book ever achieved the kind of shared, stable authority that canon required. This is also where the popular myth about church councils needs to be handled carefully. Councils did not sit down in a dark room, invent scripture from nothing, and then erase one dangerous witness. What they did, much more often, was reflect and formalize boundaries that had been developing through long use, dispute, teaching, and reception. That does not make every decision simple, and it does not mean every community drew every line at the same speed. But it does mean the Book of Enoch's position was already complicated before later lists and councils made those boundaries more visible. So why was the book not received more widely? Part of the answer is that the road to canon favored texts with clearer and more consistent standing in the shared life of the church. Part of the answer is that Enoch belonged strongly to an older apocalyptic world that remained influential but did not become the universal measuring line for doctrine. And part of the answer is that a book could be valuable as background, imagination, warning, or witness to an age without being granted final normative authority over the whole community. This is why the Ethiopian tradition matters so much in the case. It proves the story was never as simple as the book vanished because it was false. It did not vanish everywhere. One ancient Christian tradition kept it. That fact alone should make both extremes slow down. The Book of Enoch was neither a meaningless fraud nor a universally received canon book that the entire church later suppressed in one sweeping act. Its history is more demanding than either slogan. And that may be the most honest conclusion of this chapter. The Book of Enoch stood near the canon, influenced readers around the canon, and helped shape the conceptual world in which parts of the New Testament were heard. But standing near the canon is not the same as standing inside it. That is the boundary this case keeps bringing into focus. In the final chapter, we ask the question that remains for modern readers. If Enoch is not simply a hidden Bible book, and not simply a useless relic either, then how should it be read today? With caution, with curiosity, with respect, or with all three at once?
So where does that leave us now? After the fingerprints in Jude, the silence in Genesis, the dark architecture of the Watchers, and the complicated road around the canon, we arrive at the question that matters most for modern readers. What do we do with the Book of Enoch today? The first mistake would be to treat it as if the entire case has now overturned the boundaries of Scripture. That goes too far. The Book of Enoch is historically important, spiritually provocative, and deeply revealing of the world around early Judaism and early Christianity. But historical importance is not the same thing as canonical authority. A text can sharpen our understanding without becoming the final rule for faith and doctrine. That distinction is not a dismissal, it is a safeguard. The second mistake would be the opposite one, to treat the book as if it were worthless simply because it did not enter most biblical canons. That also goes too far. A text does not have to be universally canonical to be historically serious. It does not have to sit inside the Bible to illuminate the atmosphere in which biblical authors wrote, argued, warned, and hoped. And that is one of Enoch's clearest values. It helps modern readers recover a world that the New Testament often assumes but rarely pauses to explain.
That means the wisest posture is neither panic nor obsession. It is disciplined curiosity. Read Enoch not as a replacement for Scripture, but as a witness to the questions, fears, expectations, and symbolic world surrounding Scripture. Read it as a background text that helps explain why themes like judgment, rebellious powers, cosmic accountability, and the corruption of an age felt so urgent to ancient believers. Read it with interest, but also with boundaries. And those boundaries matter, because once a book gains an aura of secrecy, people are tempted to load it with more authority than the evidence can carry. They begin to treat every vivid image as if it were settled doctrine. They mistake apocalyptic intensity for automatic instauration. They build certainty where history only gives probability. That is exactly where careful reading has to slow down. The goal is not to flatten the book into irrelevance, but to resist turning it into a master key for every mystery in the Bible. In that sense, the Book of Enoch is almost a test of intellectual honesty. Can we admit that a text is influential without calling it canonical? Can we respect its age without exaggerating its authority? Can we recognize that it helped shape the imagination of an era without pretending it settles every debate about angels, demons, judgment, or the hidden structure of history? Mature reading requires all three.
And there is something else this case leaves behind. The Book of Enoch reminds us that the world of the Bible was larger, stranger, and more contested than many modern readers assume. It reminds us that the canon did not emerge in a vacuum. It reminds us that early believers lived among texts, traditions, disputes, and expectations that pressed hard against the boundaries of what would later become standard. In that way, Enoch does not weaken the Bible. It actually makes the world around the Bible more visible. So the final verdict is neither sensational nor dismissive. The Book of Enoch was not a meaningless fringe text, and it was not simply a hidden Bible that corrupt leaders erased. It was an ancient and influential witness that stood near the edge of the canon, shaped the imagination of many readers, and survived most powerfully where one historic church chose to preserve it. That is a more demanding answer than a conspiracy, but it is also a stronger one. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of this investigation. Not every important book becomes scripture. Not every excluded book becomes a threat. Sometimes the truth is harder than both extremes. A text can matter profoundly, leave fingerprints on sacred history, and still remain just outside the line. So if you read Enoch after this, read it with open eyes, read it with curiosity, read it with respect, but also read it knowing where the line is. Because the real power of this case was never in proving that the church hid a secret Bible. The real power was in discovering how a mysterious ancient text can illuminate the world behind Scripture without becoming Scripture itself. And once you see that clearly, the case does not end in confusion. It ends in focus.